So I'm here to speak about climate change. I lead a non-profit called Pakistan Environment Trust, where we strongly believe that climate change can drive economic growth for Pakistan. And taking this perspective is the key to solving this existential crisis in our country. Let me kick this off by making a few statements, and I would ask you to raise your hand if you know about these already. So number one, Pakistan is among the top 8 countries most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. Great. Pakistan is contributing less than 1% to global GHG emissions. And Pakistan is currently experiencing unprecedented heat wave compared to anything that we've ever experienced before. Amazing. So now let us raise the temperature a little bit. Let me ask a few more questions. How many of you know about the global ambition to achieve net zero by 2050? How many? Okay. How many jobs will be lost in Pakistan due to climate change? Okay. And what is the cost for Pakistan to solve the climate change crisis in our country? Okay, see, that's what I expected. And to be fair, if you knew the answer to these questions, I wouldn't know what to say for the rest of my time. In the next 10 minutes, my goal is to give you a different perspective on looking at climate change. The first 3 statements that I made were mostly familiar to all of you because they're very common in our mainstream thinking on climate change. But the last 3 questions that I posed were comparatively less familiar because they are more solution-oriented. They force us to take a very different lens and look at climate change from a very different perspective. And it is in answering the last 3 questions where lies the opportunity for Pakistan to drive economic growth and solve this climate crisis in our country. To grasp that opportunity, we need to look at some basic science behind climate change. So let's take a look at this graph behind me. In this graph, you can see the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that have remained stable over the past hundreds and thousands of years. Now take a look at the spike in the very end. That spike is being caused by the Industrial Revolution that took off somewhere between 1970s or 50s. So this spike was caused by much greater human activity. Basically, we were burning a lot more fossil fuel to generate energy. There's a lot more of us on the planet. By some estimates, the global population has tripled in the past 70 years. Now what happens is this carbon dioxide gets released in the air. The heat gets trapped in the atmosphere, causing the Earth to get warm. Now the concern is not that the Earth is getting warm. The concern is that it is happening at pace. At our current rate, scientists predict that by 2030, Earth will become too hot to live. What we're experiencing in Pakistan nowadays is a taste of what the rest of the world will feel like in the next few years. In the midst of all of this is a plan to slow this down. So in 2015, global leaders signed an agreement to limit global warming to livable conditions. That agreement led to the birth of what we know as the net zero commitment today. Under that commitment, around 120 plus countries, 200 plus cities, and many different businesses are and have made the commitment to bring their emissions down to minimum level. This net zero phenomenon is extremely important for Pakistan because it's fundamentally reshaping how human activity happens across the globe. How we build our buildings, how we light up our buildings, how we produce food and discharge waste, how we move from point A to point B. Everything has to be done in a manner that reduces emission. This kind of shift, the mankind has never experienced before in our modern history. This is massive and extremely complex. We're essentially talking about running our cities in a very different way. We're talking about running our daily lives in a very different way. Now, what are the implications for Pakistan? Understand that. Let's look at a recent research by McKinsey where they looked at the impact of net zero transition on 70 countries that contribute somewhere between 90 to 95% in the global GDP. They mapped these countries across 2 dimensions. On the left-hand side, you can see the transition exposure, which means what will happen to these economies because of net zero. And on the bottom, you can see GDP per capita, which means what is the strength of these economies to achieve net zero themselves. Now, there are three insights in this research that I want to speak about today. Number one, Pakistan is on the extreme top left of this graph, which means we are the most affected country due to climate change. Climate change is not just impacting our health and our environment, but Pakistan could potentially face the loss of millions of jobs in our economy due to climate change. Let me explain to you how. Let's take a look at the textile sector. Our textile sector employs around 40% of our workforce. Now, with the ambition to achieve net zero, most of the international brands are looking for more climate-friendly products. In this situation, if Pakistan keeps on producing products made from traditional processes that don't reduce emissions, soon these international brands will move their supply chains elsewhere. We might end up losing our exports. Our farmers will end up losing their jobs. Our economy will suffer massively. Because of this net zero movement, by some estimates, Pakistan could potentially lose somewhere between 20 to 30 million jobs in our economy. Now, the second insight from this research is that Pakistan needs to spend 70 to 80 billion dollars per year to achieve net zero. 70 to 80 billion dollars. That's twice the size of our entire annual budget. Pakistan can never invest that kind of money ourselves. The third insight from this research shows that collectively the whole world needs to spend around $9 trillion per year to achieve net zero. $9 trillion is roughly 100 times the cost we have in Pakistan to achieve net zero. That money is currently sitting in the developed countries, the countries on the bottom right of this graph. But since the challenge is in the developing countries, this money needs to move from bottom right to the top left countries like ours. So in a nutshell, Pakistan is extremely impacted, is one of or the most impacted country by climate change in all manners. We do not have the economic strength to solve this problem ourselves. But there is a huge amount of money looking for opportunities to achieve this ambition. This money will go towards opportunities that either reduce emission or adapt for climate change. Tapping into this money could potentially solve Pakistan's climate crisis and drive economic growth in our country. The world is calling it the Green Industrial Revolution. And it's for countries like ours to take a leadership role in it. So how do we do that? We need to fundamentally rethink how we run our businesses and reshape how we develop our products. And it's not that complicated to understand. Let me give you two examples. Building on the textile sector example that I gave before, because textile sector is an extremely important part of our economy. Textile sector contributes roughly somewhere between 8 to 9% in our GDP. Pakistan is among the top 10 textile exporters in the world. So most of the international fashion brands, which are essentially end buyers for our textile products, they have made the net zero commitment as well, which means they're looking for opportunities to reduce emissions in their businesses. 95% of emissions in the supply chain of these textiles, 95% emissions in these fashion brands come from the supply chain. And the supply chain are massive textile factories that we have in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other developing countries. Now, to reduce their emissions, these international brands are looking for more green products. That is, products that are developed and made through more climate-friendly processes that reduce emissions or preferably have zero emissions. Now, to supply to these fashion brands, or to keep supplying to these fashion brands, our textile companies, our farmers that supply raw material to these textile companies, our chemical companies that supply dyes and other chemicals to these textile companies, all of them need to develop their products in a much more climate-friendly manner, in a manner that reduces emissions. If we don't do that, as I said before, these international brands will move their supply chains elsewhere. So what can textile companies do about it? Well, for starters, they can shift their sources of energy from fossil fuel to more renewable sources of energy. Sources of energy like wind, solar, and others. The farmers that supply raw material to these textile companies, these farmers can grow their cotton and other raw material in a much more climate-friendly manner that reduces emissions. These textile companies need to bring innovative solutions and technologies to reduce emissions. And if they can take these bold moves and these measures, there's an opportunity waiting for Pakistan to move from being the top 10 to the top exporter of textile products across the world. But we have to act soon on this. Let me give you another example, and this one is much closer to our daily lives. Pakistan has the 5th highest demand for air conditioning across the globe. We need these cooling products in our daily lives nowadays because of the extreme heat wave that we're facing. We need these cooling products in our cars, in our houses, in our workplaces, and everywhere. Now, for most of the cooling products in Pakistan, we use a cooling agent called HFC. HFC is an extremely powerful gas that warms the earth at least 100 times more than carbon dioxide emissions, which means it is at least 100 times more harmful for the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Pakistan currently imports HFC to build our cooling products, or most of our cooling products. Now, if we were to replace that cooling gas with something called an HFO, which has a less environmental footprint and performs in the same manner, we could end up reducing our carbon emissions as well as drive our economy. To do that, we need to produce that gas locally. We need to build cooling products that use that gas. We have a brigade of mechanics in Pakistan that install and repair our ACs and refrigerators. We need to build their capabilities to be able to handle that gas. If we were able to tap into this kind of opportunity, it would not just reduce our emissions, but actually might end up creating an export market for our cooling products as well. Again, we have to act soon on this opportunity. And these are just 2 examples from 2 sectors. There are similar examples that exist in literally every other sector, ranging from transport, cement, to steel, and you can name them. In parallel, there is a huge amount of money looking for opportunities like that. We just need to go and grab that. There's an interesting lesson to learn from the Indian IT revolution in our context. In the 1980s, Indian IT exports were somewhere between $3 million. Today, Indian IT exports stand at the north of $100 billion per year. How did they do that? Let's take a look at an example of one of the Indian IT companies called Wipro. For those of us who do not know, Wipro is one of the leading IT exporters from India with an annual revenue of roughly $10 billion US. An interesting factoid to share over here is that Wipro stands for Western Indian Palm Refinery Oil. This company, Western Indian Palm Refinery Oil, was established in 1945 to manufacture vegetable oil. But in the 70s, they had a visionary leader who could sense the IT revolution happening around them and took the very bold move to shift the business away from manufacturing vegetable oil to IT and technology. And today, Wipro is one of the leading IT companies across the globe. That's the kind of thinking we need in our businesses. That's the kind of vision we need in our leaders to be able to rethink how they do their business and develop more green products. And to be honest, we don't have a choice. We're already facing the burden of climate change. If we're too slow to decarbonize and become energy independent, this climate crisis could potentially tarnish our economy completely, as well as our daily lives. However, on the flip side, if we're able to rethink the way we do business in Pakistan and develop more green products, we could actually end up leading the green industrial revolution. But we have to act now. Thank you.